mental health conference. And as soon as he walked in, I think we had decided to meet for 10 minutes, but we ended up talking like, I think 30, 40 minutes. And then I was in my senior year trying to work on my senior project. And one thought just stuck in my mind, that all the literature I was seeing was mostly on the trauma. There was nothing on the strengths or the resiliency of the community. And Zain had done a similar study in African American. So I thought we should collaborate and come up with this study, studying resiliency in Muslim youth at Michigan State University. So Zain is, why don't you introduce?
Can everyone hear me on this mic? Yeah? Good? Yeah. Okay. My name is Zain Shamoon. I'm a doctoral student in Human Development and Family Studies, with specialties in marriage and family therapy. This is my second year in the program. I'm really interested in looking at resiliency factors for disadvantaged communities. So when I reached out to Farha, I think it was a year and a half ago, we really had a lot of like-minded ideas, and so we collaborated and came up with a project, which you'll hear about in a little while. So.
Basic concept for me in this research was that when I came to America, or even in Pakistan, whenever I tried reading historical literature about America, it seems the assassination of JF Kennedy was a big turning point. And I've heard so many people start their books, their plays, and everything saying that, where were you when Kennedy was shot? And I think this is 9/11 kind of has become that kind of moment for Muslim community. So my point of the research was, where were you when 9/11 happened? So.
All right, welcome again. Can everyone see the word and the text?
Should we
pretty
turn off
easily
the
in the back?
lights?
We can dim it a little bit.
Can we dim the lights?
Okay, so the name of our study is Resiliency in Muslim American Students 10 Years After 9/11. So the question comes to mind, why study Muslims? Why care about the resiliency or the trauma that they're facing? Well, Muslim Americans are a disadvantaged population in the United States. What I mean by disadvantage is that there are levels of privilege in society that create the have-nots and the haves disproportionately on the levels of gender, religion, socioeconomic status, historical background, whether you're an immigrant or not. So looking at the Muslim American community, that means that if you look at all these levels of privilege that people do or do not have, that means specific demographics have specific experiences of their disadvantage. Muslim American demographic includes an indigenous African American population, a South Asian population, including Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lanka, and also an Arab American population, which is heterogeneous. Both born and raised here, some immigrants as well. Now, looking at what happened after 9/11 was a lot what Farha talked about. Muslim Americans were all of a sudden situated in a very heightened, difficult, socio-political climate, with increasing acts of discrimination, violence, disproportionate attention from government officials. We all saw King hearings a couple of weeks back. Skewed media portrayal. Now when we think about quality of life issues for human beings, for Americans in general, we think about safety, transportation, quality of living, happiness. But what this looks like in specific communities is different because they have different experiences. Life looks different for different people. I like to say that nobody's born with the same eyes as another person. So we all have perspective to offer to the world. So looking at what, and I think it's important before we go into our study, to honor those people who have come before us, who made it possible for us to get to the stage we are now in the literature, in the study of Muslim Americans. Generally, what the literature shows is that Muslim Americans are suffering, they're distressed, they have symptoms that may look like the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sure you guys have heard this in other presentations. But beyond the overt acts of discrimination you may see on the news, there are also those things that are what we call microaggressions. Those daily slights that happen in passing, and only those people in disadvantaged identity spaces realize what's happening. And the people who deliver those microaggressions don't necessarily have a bad intention, but there's something about how we understand our interactions with those who are disadvantaged that allows these things to persist. And I know I'm being a little bit vague, but let me give you an example. So I'm a Muslim American. Sometimes in class, I grew up in Novi, Michigan, very white suburban town. In class, after 9/11, so Zain, what do the Muslims think about this? That's a microaggression because there's an assumption that I know everything about all the Muslims in the world and I can speak on behalf of them. Now you couldn't ask a white kid to do that, right? How about on the news? So-and-so has committed an offense, and it speaks on behalf of the entire population. Things like that, the underlying themes that we don't notice in our daily interactions with people who are disadvantaged. So the Muslim Americans have a specific one. So let's look at what the literature has given us over the past 10 years. So, Padella and Heisler, they recently published this article, but they started a research initiative around 2002, 2003, looking at the health outcomes of Muslim Americans after 9/11. So they took a representative sample of Muslims and non-Muslims who were of Arab American descent, which is, again, heterogeneous, in the Detroit metropolitan area, Dearborn. So they were looking at the perceptions of discrimination. So if I feel like I've been discriminated against, if I'm reporting that, how is that correlated with my happiness, my distress, and my overall health? And that includes physical, mental, psychological. What they found was, surprise, surprise, that if you were experiencing elevated levels of prejudice, you weren't as happy, you weren't, you were pretty distressed, and your health wasn't very good. The importance of this study, though, was that it was one of the first initiatives that asked Muslims what they thought about what was going on. A lot of times when research is done about disadvantaged populations, we make assumptions about what we should do clinically, community-based programs and whatnot, just by passively understanding, them filling out something, or we assess them, or we observe them. What's going on? You hear this on the media. So what's going on in the Muslim American population? And rarely, and it's good when it happens, and it's very uplifting when it happens, but rarely are the Muslims talking about what's going on with the Muslim American population. More recently, it's been better. What's important about this, and I'll throw out an analogy, is even if you were to create the best intervention, it's kind of like creating the best shoe. But it's pretty irrelevant if it's too big or too small for the person you're giving it to. Which means that your interventions have to fit. And how can you make it fit without even measuring the person's foot, without even asking them what's going on? You can't. It's impossible. Another basic advantage coming from the literature in the past 10 years. Wahiba Abu-Raz has done some beautiful work and published many things. In 2008, her article commented on a research study that her and a team of researchers had done. And they were concerned with the community sense of well-being. So they took the Muslim perspective and they took it a step further. So how do Muslim Americans, or those who are associated with the stereotypes, and I should circle back for a second. Now, we're not just talking about Muslim Americans, we're talking about anybody who deals with who is affected by those stereotypes. So that includes Arab Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, anybody who might get some trouble at the airport, put it that way. So she wanted to see what would happen if we had people not only speaking from, because the other one was a survey methodology, she wanted people to talk together. So what is it like when people talk together? And the importance of this is that beyond just people commenting or circling what they, their level of distress in certain situations, these people were adding discussion, narrative to what was going on. They were really, really deepening our understanding of what was going on. So there were 8 semi-structured interviews to collect data, and what they found was that, surprise, surprise again, that if you were experiencing hate crimes, higher levels of feelings of anxiety, you were unsure about your future, you felt like your safety was threatened, typically, and you felt pretty isolated. Isolation is an interesting thing for Muslim Americans, because a lot of Muslim American demographics are collectivists, right? The importance of being together, community, reaching out, resources. So if you feel alone, anyway in society, in an individualistic society, and now a trauma has happened, deepening your sense of isolation, there's a problem. The importance of this research initiative is that it was a qualitative focus. They were going beyond the data points to look at how people explain their experience. Finally, in our research, looking at what the literature has done over the past 10 years, we pulled out this article. Agnew, Stove, Vargo, and O'Donnell looked at the effects of trauma on adolescent youth in a low-income community of New York City. Now, what they were interested in looking at, and the reason that they looked at adolescents is because they wanted to see what would happen at a sensitive developmental phase of a person's life when they experience trauma, and what does it mean for their future. Now that is not said to belittle the experience of trauma when you're an adult, but there's a difference. If you're still formulating your identity, if you're still soaking up messages like a sponge, and you're 12, 13 years old, already trying to make sense of your world, and then trauma happens, it means something different. There's an element there that's important to understand. There's a crucial factor there. Perspectives of youth then become extremely important in understanding what happens to the trajectory of people who experience trauma, stigma, discrimination at these periods of their lives, and then what happens 10 years later. This is a longitudinal study. What they found was that exposure, meaning that something happened to your family, something happened to the economy of where you were, something happening to you because of 9/11, exposure, tended to correlate with higher rates of anger. For the Muslims in the room, how many angry youth have you seen recently? I've seen a lot. Okay. Post-traumatic stress symptoms we already talked about, and hopelessness. Now, although this study doesn't specifically address Muslim American demographics, it highlights the importance of asking youth. Often in our societies, in our literature, we don't think about the youth perspective because what do they know, right? But there's something about their time period and growing up within that time period and the things that happened historically that matters. It really matters. So what have we learned? It's important to ask Muslim Americans what they feel about their situation. It's important to deepen that by allowing them to have enriching discussions about what's going on for them with each other so they can disagree, agree with each other, and get a sense of how they talk together or understand these things together. And finally, the youth perspectives are important in understanding how trauma affects human beings overall. This brings us to our current study. Basically, either I haven't seen it, and either we haven't seen it in our extensive review, or there just simply isn't any study that puts all of these elements together at once. The youth in focus groups talking about their experiences. And let's add another element to that. How about what's working? For the last 10 years, it's been essential for us to understand the trauma, what it does, and the problems. But if you look at the discussion sections of those literature reviews, how can you comment on what we should do if all your understanding is the nature of the problem? There's not even a discussion on, so what's working for you? We get the implication that there's no resources within the Muslim American community, that these people are just distressed, they can't do anything. Well, I would challenge that that's not because there aren't resources. I think it's more because nobody's asked. Nobody's asked. Current study hopes to change that. So what did we do? Well, we wanted to bring back what the literature did well, and that's ask the Muslims what they think. So we had a sample of Muslim American students from Michigan State. We used the snowball approach when we went and got them, meaning that I showed up at a MSA, Muslim Student Association event, and said, we need participants. And through people interacting with their peers, we got a focus group together. And the idea was that we didn't want to inform their responses to our questions, so we had to have very vague ones, so that they were empowered to speak on what they sort of felt. So they were open-ended questions. We weren't leading them to any responses. So these questions, if you're interested to know, were, what happened to you in the days following 9/11? What helped you deal with that? What is it like for you now? How do you handle it now? And looking back at 9/11, what advice would you give a Muslim who is still dealing with that? And the point here, and I should circle back, that these students were between 18 and 23, which means that at the time of 9/11, they were either pre-adolescents, emerging adolescents, or adolescents. So the point here is that this is a phenomenological study, which means when we ask these questions, we're looking at what themes are coming out consistently. What is everybody saying is something that we're doing in the community, and that isn't being deepened enough, isn't being heightened enough, isn't informing programs, isn't informing how people respond to us clinically, or in our health context, our doctors. What is it? What is across these things that we can look at? This is what we found so far. When you ask these students what was going right for them, what made them strong after 9/11, they said education. And I should point out that we only included those themes that were saturated within the focus group and were saturated in every focus group. That they were talked about a lot in every focus group. So we didn't include things that were just talked about a lot in focus group 1 and 3 and not in 2. Or those things that were kind of talked about here and kind of talked about there. These were talked about every time, and a lot. Education. They said, when I felt like I knew something about my religion, when I felt like I knew something about my status as an American legally, when I felt like I knew something about policy, that when somebody said something to me to challenge my Americanness or my ability to flourish as a human being, that I wouldn't take it to heart because I knew better than that. I educated myself. And on top of that, they had a willingness to go and educate others about their Muslim American identity. A lot of times that's really scary. They went and did that. And on top of that, they were talking about how they were willing to hear the perspectives of those who didn't quite understand. Not just looking at people who don't know as, oh man, they're just demonic and they're out to get us. You know, it was more of like, let's engage, let's talk. This is consistent across all groups. And they said it helped when that happened. The second thing, the social environment. They said that when they went through this experience of trauma and there were other people going through it with them, the camaraderie of the struggle, it was easier to handle because the weight wasn't just on them. When their parents reached out, when community mentors, religious leaders, friends especially, reached out and were experiencing things together, things were a little bit easier. And this last thing, gender identity. There was a difference in the discussions of men and women within our study. Now, that doesn't necessarily imply that there's something inherent about man that just makes them more resilient. To me, it says there's something in the community that allows the privilege of men to have access to resilience easier than to women. And I think part of what they talked about was that there are physical identification pieces. That when you're looked at, if somebody looks at me, they can think I'm Hindu, they can think I'm Christian, they can think I'm Muslim. But if I'm a sister with a hijab on, or even if I'm wearing a t-shirt that says Muslim, when there were things happening like that it was, people just made assumptions, and people made life hell. And I'll get into it. A lot of the men also talked about their mothers and how they saw very vividly that their experience was different than their mother and their sister in the same family. So I'll get into that. That's why it says ready for interviews. But before we get into that, I want to talk about an underlying theme here. If you understand that education helps, and if you understand that social environment helps, and if you understand the formulation of your gender identity helps you understand how exposure comes off to you and what that means for you specifically, there's self-acceptance going on. You know, you're not just aware of what's going on, but you're now situated. Okay, this is what's going on, so let's move forward. That was an underlying theme. They were ready to move. They weren't like, oh, this shouldn't be. They were like, well, this is what is, and we need to move forward. There was an acceptance there. But they also called for it, and it was implied when they talked about what was working, community acceptance. Now, I just got back this morning from another conference in Washington, D.C. And the conference was Substance Abuse Mental Health Association Conference it's a minority fellowship program, and they were talking about the experiences of minorities and disadvantaged populations and how our resources in the community tend to go in favor of those people who have already historically been helped, still in 2011. So we had those discussions. And I walked you into a particular, we had a breakout session, and so I walked in the session that I chose, talked about juvenile justice system and how those who are victimized by their communities, by the socio-political climate, act out in their youth, and then are named, labeled criminal. Now, as this presenter was speaking about this, I started reflecting about my own experiences. Growing up in Novi, Michigan, I saw a lot of hard drug use. I did. It was a middle class to upper middle class, pretty much white community. But I saw a lot of hard drug use. I saw what looked like cover-ups of rape. A lot of substance abuse. But if you didn't do it 20, 30, or 40 times, the officer would slap your wrist and you come back to school. But if you're a minority on first offense at age 11, you're admitted into the juvenile justice system. So what does that say? The reason that I bring this up is that the Muslim American community at large is not that different in how the legal system responds to youth that are from minority backgrounds. That is, well, if this person is acting out, we don't try to have compassion by, this person might experience stress in their life, family dynamics, their parents are, whatever, and it doesn't justify their actions, but what message does it send? You're not welcome to masjid. All the other kids are going to be affected by your misbehavior. What message does that send? You tell them that there's no hope for them. This needs to change. It needs to change in our research, it needs to change in our literature, and the students are telling us that when it does change, they're resilient. When they believe that they're educated, they're resilient. When people are there for them, they're resilient. So we have a responsibility. I'll share what some of the youth from this study have said on the topic of education. Educate yourself about your religion, about the media, and just pretty much what's being said out there. And also, just know who you are. You should get participant 2. I feel like just through talking about it, educate people, I feel like education is the only way to get through this. Like, this is just something that I feel just some people are just ignorant about. They just don't know anything about Islam. We have to educate them. That's the only way people are going to learn. I feel like that's the only way we're ever going to get past this education. And that's what I try to do. the topic of social environment. I moved to Rochester and saw a lot more Muslim people around me, and that helped. It made you feel like, oh, I'm not being singled out. There's other people like me. Same thing at the university. There's a ton of Muslims here. Everywhere you go, you see someone like me wearing a hijab. It's not like a sense of isolation. So that definitely helps. At least for me, my environment wasn't hostile towards Muslims or brown people in general. Obviously it was terrible, but it was like nobody ever came up to me and made any comments or attacked me for being Muslim or brown or Arab or anything like that. Because this participant's environment was a little bit different. The topic of gender. And it had a lot to do with the fact that we're males too. So being, male, he meant men. Don't take this to mean that he didn't understand the difference between sex and gender, but you kind of blend in with everyone else. But at least for my mom, who wears a headscarf, when I've been around her before, I've seen definitely some people, comment and different attitudes from people. And this is probably one of the most powerful. After 9/11, maybe a year or two ago, an incident happened when my mom was going to Toronto and someone was on the bus. Someone on the bus was scared that she was a terrorist, and they called the police and they had the SWAT team stop the bus. They searched the entire bus, they found her, they pointed a giant AK-like gun in her face. My mom's about 4'9", as you know, she's not very deadly. She had a gun pointed in her face. She was pulled out of the bus and searched. She covers her head. So what happens if I'm stressed out because I think that some people are looking at me a funny way and I'm on the bus and I want to call the police? You think the police is going to call me? So what does this mean? Where are we now? Talked about good things that are happening in the community. Well, if we're looking at those things that are already within the community, it means that we need to start deepening them. This is just a bunch of talk. Basically, say the same thing here. It means that the clinical work needs to start being relevant to the people that we bring in. Why don't we see Muslim Americans go and see marriage counseling outside of whatever's available in the community, or whatever's scarcely there? Because those spaces aren't yet relevant to them in many ways. Researchers, clinicians, religious leaders, community leaders need to ask, what's going on for you? Community work needs to start deepening those things that are already written. Create environments where you can have discussions about what does your hijab mean and what troubles have you faced because of it. Create spaces where people are coming together. If it's not in their high schools, if it's not in large society, as we know, create it. Because we look at when the students experience it, when it's rare, they experience it, they're doing a little better. Research needs to stop circulating with the same thing. How many studies have regurgitated the same thing about post-traumatic stress symptoms and distress? And that's important. But what does it say about us as a Muslim American community or those interested in Muslim research that if 10 years from now we're still like, well, they're struggling, and we haven't done anything about it? The religious context. Now, I have a very, I'll say, limited understanding of my religion, and I say that to, it's not to say that I don't study my religion, it's just that I don't want to pretend like I'm a scholar or anything like that. But at the same time, I do know scholars of old used to make sure that when somebody came to them, and this is in the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when somebody came to them, and they came to them with a question, we were supposed to respond by understanding the person's situation first. Certainly there are those things that are consistent across peoples in religion, like those things that are mandatory, as religions include. But how you teach those things and how you address those things specifically with certain people matters. It does. And we can't just say that, oh, whatever, I tried. We're able to think like we can be critically minded, especially as adults. Situate an environment where we look at a person's context, appreciate it, and respond in a way that's going to be helpful. We need to think about what's going to be helpful. So I encourage religious leaders, researchers, community programmers, clinicians, doctors, start working together. Because we all have roles in society where we can create something different. So that our general sense isn't distress. But our general sense is, well, yeah, you know, we're having trouble, rightly so. We were disproportionately discriminated against after 9/11, and we're distressed. But you know what? We got this. We're going to take care of our own. And those interested in helping anybody disadvantaged, let's look at what's going to help. Finally, just to reiterate, the youth initiatives. Stop belittling the youth. They have experiences at their age, in certain eras, where they can offer a lens through which they see the world. And if there's a disconnect between intervention and how people see the world, what are we even doing? Are we really even helping? And that's all. Well, questions?
Thank you, Zain. At the youth initiatives, all my daughters, awareness and acceptance. I always like to talk about just quickly my personal experience. I came to Michigan and 9/11 happened. I was watching it on the TV and I was going through immense trauma of immigrating to a new culture. I had 3 young kids. I remember the reason I left my country was to keep my kids safe from this terrorism, this trauma. And to have this followed me here and to know that a Muslim somehow is involved with the crime or the trauma, it was so devastating. I remember going numb. There were tears running down my face and I realized I had a parent-teacher meeting that day. So I drove with tears running down my face. I walked into the classroom and the teacher looked at me and she got up and hugged me and said, "We will get through this." That "we" made me an American citizen in a second that no paperwork or INS could have done. So I cannot emphasize enough the role of being accepted. Thank you, and any questions, please?
Did you try to compare with the lower SES group? Or these are all university students who are generally high SES or middle SES?
Right.
Well, what we
I was
didn't...
wondering if you compare with the lower SES group and then see what they're after.
So this research is ongoing. If we were to code it, we could see those differences. The purpose of this research was to look at what the general themes were going on across cultures. I would encourage, though, I think further research sets up a platform for further research to look at those differences. And I think that if we picked apart ours, we could do that. But because we didn't have those questions that are inherent to the research study, it would be kind of difficult to set those implications. We have to be true to our model. So I think that there definitely will be some stuff in the coding when we see, what our specific demographics saying. Again, the research needs to heighten that understanding.
And the sample size?
The sample size, now, something I need to clarify. In a phenomenological study, a qualitative study, the sample size isn't to be looked at the same way as a quantitative study, because you're not necessarily looking at generalizability. You're more extracting what is the phenomena of what's going on, what are the stories. So our sample size is small, but it was increasing. Part of it is we had 4 groups. We had a 5th one set up that really could never make it, and it was about, how many? 7 to 9 total participants. It wasn't many, but again, we only included things that every single participant was saying, and they were extremely diverse in age. Some of them were at the high, like older end, 23, some were on the lower end, 18, 17, and so it was things that were said a lot throughout, so yeah.
We, just going along with that, we took being at the university as the initial point of resilience. So we wanted to see what's working with them for them to have made it to this point. Another thing, the problem that we run into is, again, the stigma in the community, the fear in the community. So even when we tried to advertise it really hard, the students were very reluctant to participate. They were not sure why we are doing this or what's. And I'm hoping that because it's an ongoing and because now we are going to have the university get more involved to take it to more departments and hope for a better result.
I mean, part of this is that when we look at the impasses of how hard it is to do a study with Muslim Americans, well, there's a couple of things that I'd like to reflect on. One thing is that look how, I mean, it's not necessarily the themes that are important. Look how much you can get just by asking a few people questions. Look at what it can do, and if you were to take that further, what it would mean. The other part about this is that the impasses sort of highlight an inherent issue with how researchers interact and the relationship between researchers and Muslim Americans in general. That if we haven't dispelled certain stigmas, if we're not sort of including ourselves within their processes, it becomes very hard. And it was difficult for me. I was part of the Muslim Students Association for 4 years when I was an undergrad, and it was still difficult. You know, I'm part of another research study on campus and recruited people for that. I got 50 people within like 2 or 3 weeks. It's just it's different. So.
I love the focus group methodology and I've used it, but I also wonder about a weakness that might be called self-selectivity. Because you said you used a snowball approach. But that still means it's those who are willing to show up who show up, and what's happening with the other.
Definitely. I mean, that's absolutely true.
And this, I mean, because there was nothing available in the literature, we just felt something has to be started. And we were also curious, like, what are we going to find out? And now that we are really encouraged, we hope to kind of work through the other biases and have a more relevant research done.
Well, could you take what you found and disseminate it?
Right.
So that there could then be people who otherwise wouldn't speak up, who would be like the woman Dr. Akbar talked about, who read something and said, that's about me.
Right.
I mean, is that a technique that's used to draw people out?
We are hoping, definitely we are hoping. One thing, we did not want to have any predisposed ideas about the research, so we kept it, I mean, until unless they showed up for the group, they didn't know what questions we are going to ask them. So if that kind of, we tried to kind of take the bias out, because we couldn't circulate the questions.
I think that, I mean, it's hard to remove that from it, to kind of divorce the idea that the bias of the people who already show up for the study that are willing to do with it, willing to do that. It's already, I mean, it's hard to do that, especially when we're talking about narratives and it's so hard to talk about your stories. But I think that if we were to reflect on this and what happened and what isn't necessarily the best in the model, how can we be creative so we can get a sense of how resources look for people who aren't willing to talk about it as much. So.
And also, as soon as we started asking them about 9/11, there was a hesitancy. They would be quiet for a little bit, and then they would find their voice and start talking about it. And this is exactly what we need to tap into. That I'm concerned that are they blocking the experience, or is it not discussed in the house, or the parents were uncomfortable because they were like 6, 7 years old when this happened. So that was a big issue there that I picked on too in the sessions.
One of the ideas that came out late in the game, but not enough time for this conference, was that it's important to go to the people, especially when there's stigma. And I think that, again, it highlights it. And talking about the qualitative focus, some people were silent for a long time, and then when they saw that their peers were talking, it made it okay. Made it okay to talk.
And I remember they were also concerned, oh, are we being taped, or how? So, I mean, it is a very sensitive issue, and we tried to create an environment where they can open up and talk about it. And we really hope to continue the work and do more, but it's still, I still see the guards coming down. So I think the instant reaction is that nothing to do with us or something like that, you know, in the youth. So there's a lot of work we need to do. Sorry, Sean.
So, first of all, congratulate you for the excellent have a similar Methodist question about my concern with the selection bias isn't so much, their willingness to participate, but the fact you're drawing from the MSA, that already there's kind of a group of people who identify themselves as Muslims and tend to be more Muslim activists, whatnot. But the advantage, what I thought was going to be interesting, the snowball approach, is that you're going to get their friends. We all have people, friends who are not practicing all of that. And so, I mean, if that's the direction you want to take it to the subject of Brooklyn. Other things is that there's only so many Muslims in Michigan State. So I wonder if you want to get IIB approval to expand to other universities where, and also particularly target people, not MSAs, but friends of MSA kids, so that we can get sort of diversity in terms of religiosity.
I think we absolutely agree with. I mean, that's absolutely important. Part of what we did when we clarified, we actually submitted this to the National Council of Family Relations earlier in November. And when we wrote our proposal up, one of the things we clarified is that we wanted an inherent bias because these people are saying that they're Resilient, they're going to these spaces to talk about these issues to begin with, which a lot of people. So we took it from that angle. That
the bias is that they have kind of a Muslim identity. And so you might have people who don't have strong Muslim identities but are resilient.
Right.
So the question about resilience, not so much Muslim identity.
Right. Right. And definitely we can do that. Definitely the plan is to take it to other campus and other areas. Definitely. We will. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I wanna really commend and congratulate the research on an awesome study and awesome presentation. I do want to caution some of us there are cultural assumptions even within research methodology. Not necessarily saying that some of the things reported earlier, had some of those underpinnings, but I will say that some of the things that we may start to look at the context of just where we are in terms of the state of the literature, in terms of what's being exposed and what you're looking for, what we're looking for really. And then if you look at research assumptions, I'm wondering, can you really be objective? Because the next thing I want to ask you is, given this thing, but what was 9/11 like for you? And how biased can that be? So, I'm wondering, what are you actually trying to look for? Yeah, there are some nuances in terms of limitations, but what are we trying to get out of this whole phenomenon? Yeah, and what was 9/11?
Do you have time for me to answer that question?
Sure.
Okay. I was 13 years old, and I was a freshman in high school. And man, it was weird. I didn't know if my family was going to. I didn't know if my family was going to be in the country the next week. I just thought anything was possible given the way they were talking about Muslims on the news, or just the conjecture and the ideas, and I just had no idea. And I was young. And what deepened that scare for me was that the next day, so September 12th, walked on the bus and they're playing a very haunting Sarah McLachlan song on the bus, and it was like, okay, here we go. Everyone's staring at me on the bus because my skin color is a little bit different. And so that was a very lonely ride to school. And then I remember I had a first period science class, 9th grade science class, and I was waiting outside, and so we would often sit next to the class. We'd wait for the teacher to come, and we came early before school started. And these two students came up, I think they were juniors or seniors, and one of them put his foot in my face, and he said, "Stupid Arab." And I didn't know what was gonna happen. I think, is this kid gonna kick me? And I sort of just laughed and walked away. It became an opportunity, and my awareness as an adolescent at that time, it became an opportunity, and we're seeing it now more openly, even from people in our government. It became an opportunity for those prejudices that were covert to be, here we go, you're gonna get it now, kid. So.
And it's interesting that you say that too, because when 9/11 happened, the first place I went to was the bus. I took an opposite approach. I became real angry, kind of like a here we go again, but I was, you know, in all honesty, I was looking for someone to say something, because I put my goofy on. I was like, say something about a woman, you know, like say something, you know, I was in that, but it's, you know, it's really interesting, you're talking about what's down here and what has risen up, so, you know.
There was a very interesting experience I had right after 9/11. One of my students was a black girl student. Thank God it's the first time he was living in Detroit and talking about Hebrew. Thank God it's the first time that the cops did not look at me. And I was scared. But my other question is that, don't you think those kids or the youth at that time, which you are interviewing, they have their preconceived prejudice, preconceived fear, and preconceived background of their parents, their perception toward the fear of atheism under those circumstances, and they feel that reflecting that?
I mean, I think if I'm just reflecting on my opinion on that, I think sure. I mean, there's so many. You can't divorce the immigrant experience from 9/11. I mean, from 9/11 and what fears were carried on that were existing before 9/11, and how did they deepen, or how did they, you know, formulate together and create something
That
new?
would be an interesting problem to look at. That we look similar to Hindus. And you try to compare and see what is their experience and what's our experience. Sometimes we impose the fear on us, and then we try to look through that experience.
What's very interesting about that fear is that I think, and this is a historical issue too, if anybody knows the history of how the Irish got into the United States, you know, they weren't considered, you know, Caucasian in most senses, and Irish. So what happens is there was this, you know what, if you want to become one of us, then make sure that you hate on the blacks. And that was the underlying message. And so they differentiated themselves from another group. And you'll see this happen between Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, and between blacks that are not Muslim and blacks that are Muslim, or blacks that are not Muslim and Muslims in general. Somebody told me once, you know what, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but at least it's not us anymore. Which is ignorant on many levels, because that means that they're not looking at the ongoing prejudice of their own community. But I think that, yeah, we, at some levels, we're historically socialized to like fight against each other instead of doing anything. So.
Yeah, Steve?
I think you're opening an important and very interesting can of worms just by starting this kind of research and being part of this viewing and looking at and evaluating. And it's very encouraging for me to hear this and to think that you have an opportunity to stimulate and link up with other efforts around the country.
Absolutely.
And beyond the Muslim and Middle Eastern American communities, being a targeted community.
Right.
And history, you know, during 30 years ago, the Irish were jailed for going mass, you know, in the military. So it's interesting to see how everyone can change seats to be on a hot seat. So I see what you're doing as looking at those kind of dynamics that every community has an investment in knowing about and understanding.
Absolutely. Sabah, you had a question?
I kind of had a comment also. I think that the whole experience, and for kind of your experience kind of talks to this too, but even for our parents, so I'm a second generation American, but I think this whole experience kind of brought alive some of those same memories and maybe traumas that our own parents experienced as immigrants, as you mentioned. For example, like my mother growing up in India as a minority, a religious minority, and the way they dealt with that, and I think we see that a lot even now, still dealing with it, and how engaged we are in the political process is because sometimes if you were a minority in your own home country, the way that you dealt with that was just, you know what, just kind of being quiet and being the model citizen, not making a lot of noise.
Right.
And that, I mean, actually after September 11th, I was in college, which kind of dates me, but I was an undergrad, and my parents, who are, you know, pretty, I mean, they're practicing and they're, you know, usually very visible in their religiosity. My dad actually told me, I mean, they were afraid for my safety. My dad actually told me, just don't wear the scarf. It's not supposed to be endangering for you. It's part of you, but it shouldn't be something that's endangering your life. And that was really surprising for me that my dad told me that. I mean, I think that also speaks to, I was involved in the Detroit Mosque study, you know, about 8 years ago. ago. And that's something that we really saw too when we were going to the mosques. There was a lot of suspicion, so we had these surveys. We tried to do the focus groups too, but we had the surveys that we took after Jummah to different mosques around the area, and there was a lot of suspicion, a lot of, especially first generation, I would say, for like, well, who's collecting this information? Where's the information going to? Why are you collecting it? What, you know? And it really took a lot to really still, again, get the community engaged. And so while we're really trying to encourage that, there's this psychology and this dynamic that we kind of have to address that's very deep and rooted and seated.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I would definitely commend you for doing this. I think it's absolutely crucial to be able to identify components of resiliency just from the amount of the individuals that are experiencing the level of distress that they're reporting. I'm also curious about level of distress and maybe in the beginning and geographical variables in relation to this. So certain places or cities where there are larger groups of Muslims, they may be able to mitigate some of those factors of experiencing the level of distress that you outlined that these individuals did. In addition to that, I also think that I'm not sure if the research is available on this about the level of distress that exists right now and the level of resiliency that Muslims exhibit currently, and focusing that process to saying, well, as a result of this, now can we qualitatively look at this scenario? If there is such a huge discrepancy between the two, how can we create focused programs towards or focused interventions that will alleviate this level of distress that they're experiencing to kind of bridge the gap between these two variables?
Definitely.
What made you determine the age group in selecting only college students as opposed to opening it up to the community?
The age, well, for the age group, math, like I just thought, these kids were 11, 9, 10, 12, at the time, and I was really inspired by the work that had been done in the literature about trauma and what happens for those kids, like longitudinally after that. And I thought, like, man, that would be so novel to ask that about the Muslim American community.
And the other thing was also that both of us were in Michigan State, so we wanted to start close to home and see like what we find there. And between two of us, it was crazy enough between our schedules that we didn't want to immediately extend it to a bigger, and we wanted to see if we get some positive themes, recurring themes, then we can take it to the community and take it to other places.
And I wanted to add that two of our other authors are actually here. Author, if you can raise your hand, Dr. Richard Wampler is right over there.
Richard,
and one of the ideas that was sort of driving this was the microaggression thing. And so we thought that if we take students, they have to go to class every day. So what is said to them on their daily, if they experience this thing every day, what is that about? And so how will they respond to these questions based on that as well? So.
And I guess a follow-up to that was, did they reveal any acts of hate or anything like that? And was there any sense of them reporting it to either authorities, or were they afraid to do so?
There was a little bit. I don't think the questions lent to that discussion, but they definitely
about the mom.
They said about the mom when they talked about other people, because they were kind of like on that tip of like, man, I'm strong, and they kind of talked about that a little bit more. But when they had the freedom to talk about other people, they talked about other family members, and they talked about their friends, and they talked at length sometimes about the experiences that those people face. So.
You can initiate the panel now.
Yeah, we'll take one more question.
Yes, Sylvia.
I don't exactly have a question, I have a comment, and so much what I heard today really resonates because of my background. My husband, Pat McCall, who was the state senator for 16 years, and his mother was the state rep for 7 years, she represented Dearborn. And I lived in Dearborn for approximately 20 years, Japanese. And so in working with the neighborhoods and working with the various ethnic groups, I really began to see all the different changes that were taking place in the Dearborn and 10th District, 7th District. And it was really, in a lot of ways, comical, and Farha heard these stories before. But my job, or I shouldn't say my job, but what I did, I'm a political organizer. And so I basically kept our organization together and went out and solicited support and help and participation from as many ethnic groups as there were represented in Dearborn at that time, which was not only the Arab population, but Polish, Hungarian, Asian, Italian. I mean, we have it all in Dearborn. And I found that when we would do an event, and I would have the organizations together, and our tickets all the commitments and all of that, and they would come to my home and we would do our meetings. One set, or one group of the Arab community would come, but not if they knew the other group was coming, or if this group was coming. So I wound up having to go to each 5 different groups to meet with each individual, the leadership of the individuals. And I, was respectful of all this and did it for probably the first 3 or 4 weeks. And after that, I just ran out of patience, frankly, and didn't have the time. And so I finally just came down to the point where he said, I respect all of your feelings about not being able to work with each other or associate with each other or trust each other, whatever the problem is. But you're in America now. We want you to be part of our organization, but we all have to be together at one time. And it was really interesting because gradually it did. I mean, it all functioned very well. People came together from all different groups, and it was like a little UN, United Nations dinner, and it was really amazing. And we would have all these different ethnic groups coming together for our events and parties, and we did, particular parties for each group, and then we did them together as a collective group. And by the time we left office, I mean, the feeling within all of the communities was just one of community interest and support and friendship, and it was really a wonderful thing to see. And during our campaigns, the amazing thing would be all of these little kids that would come to my house to help us go door to door and get leaflets and all of this type of thing. And I had like 20, kids between the ages of 8 and 12 who would come to my house every morning. This is Michaela, are you ready to go? And they were just amazing children.
I think definitely sense of community coming together. That's the important thing, definitely. You remind me of a very interesting incident. In my residency at one time, I was the first Muslim resident in my residency and first Pakistani. But after they took me, every year they started taking more Pakistani residents. So one day we were having lunch and we all 3 were fighting about politics, about everything under the sky, and the attending said, oh my God, Pakistanis fight? And I was like, so naturally, it's like you will always have that too, but I think coming together is important. And I would,
And if I could just take one more time, when you talk about, the situation as it is today, like you said, it's not unique to what's happening right now. I mean, you talk about the Irish, which of course I'm Irish, Scotch Irish, so I know all of that history, but look at the Japanese in this country, during World War II, and what happened there, and how, there's been a lot of discrimination down to the history of this country, because no one is being singled out, in the long scope.
definitely. I mean, I took that point up post 9/11. I had my article in Lansing State Journal. We talked about racial profiling in that, and I agree. Not every Italian is involved with mafia. Not every